Tournament mindset, aren't we? So, yeah, so if you can put your names on there and fill out the surveys, then we'll do a drawing. And we have a number of books and a really cool poster that Jean has contributed, and also the skulls. We're going to get them autographed, and you get one of those. So each one of those is we'll spread the wealth. Okay? So, all right, having said that, without further ado, I give you Dr. Forgeng.
So thanks to everyone for showing up. Thanks especially to Jeff for inviting me to speak here today at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. My former friend Jeff.
Once is better than none.
And it's actually a very timely moment to give this presentation, because you actually have the chance to get the kind of the initial scoop prior to the actual publication of the new edition of 133. As probably everybody in the room knows, the book is the edition is about to be republished by the Royal Armouries in a deluxe edition that's going for something like $1,000 a pop. Which incidentally is what the original edition is still selling for. On Amazon.com, with it I had saved up my author's copies, because I could be in Tortuga right now enjoying the beach. But in the process of preparing the new edition, we really were able to dig deep, discover some tremendous new things, and you are really the first people who are going to get a peek at what's actually in this book. And it didn't even cost you $1,000 right there. The weekend has so paid for itself already.
Just hit the space bar.
Thank you. There we go. So this is about the time when I actually started in on this historical combat lark. Me and the buddies in grad school got ourselves a set of Rutger steel swords, the White Jackson's 3 Elizabethan fencing manuals, started working our way through Degrassi, and I remember sitting at the airport on one occasion with Jeremy, the fellow on the left, the two of us lamenting the absence of any medieval sources that would allow us to reconstruct medieval combat, wondering how one would actually go about doing that. And and then lo and behold, within 2 years of that photo being taken, I came across this catalog of a touring exhibition from the Royal Armouries. I had been in the States in the 1980s with this page in it, and was totally blown away. The notion that there was something from 1300, that early, with obviously clear or a great deal of technical detail about the art of sword fighting. Clearly, I just couldn't even believe that nobody had ever made this book available. But not surprisingly, the people with an interest in historical combat didn't have the Latin skills to handle this text. The people with the Latin skills didn't really have the interest in swordsmanship. So over the next couple of years, I started working on the manuscript, and by the way, I'm delighted to see that we have some TV options. If I start getting bored, you could opt for something a little bit more interesting here. It started working with the Royal Armouries. This is that's me and John Waller at the relatively new Leeds installation. Around 1997, you can just make out the spectacular elephant armor in the left background up there. The text took a long time to work through. It's extremely difficult. But ultimately I was able to mostly piece it together, but some major new discoveries in the re-editing in the past year. To recap, for those who may not be as familiar with the book, given various titles, it's Royal Armouries Manuscript 133. That's not an I there. The 1 is the prefix that the Royal Armouries use for two-dimensional objects in their collection, works on paper, manuscripts, and such. Current best guess at the dating is about 13 1325. That's the date that's offered in the recent survey of the German manuscripts published, and by Rainer. No, it's not Rainer. Michael, you must. I'm spacing out on his name.
Describe.
From Würzburg.
I don't know.
The recent, anyway, the recent catalog, it does have to be read with some circumspection, but I think he's... Rainer Lang, thank you very much. Rainer Lang's catalog, it does have to be read with some care because it was not as solid as one might have hoped in some areas, but the 1325-ish date does seem pretty reasonable based on what we know. Still the oldest known text of its kind, 64 pages, a whole bunch of sequences in different lengths with additional possible techniques mentioned but not illustrated. The text is in Latin with some German content, technical words interspersed. Bulk of it is in prose, but there are bits, snatches of verse as well. And just to remind those who may not have prepared last night, reread the original edition, just to make sure they were up to speed by this morning. It kind of goes through the sequences sort of stage by stage with little bits of verse inserted into the Latin text, technical terms like Hauptschild and Longort interspersed in amidst the in German interspersed amidst the Latin text, and so it'll play out the sequence stage by stage. This is sort of the kind of seminal central sequence of the entire manuscript, ending in the signature Schildschlag of the 133 style, the shield strike. The buckler is for the most part, a sort of common man's weapon. It's something that's carried with civilian clothing, a small, readily portable shield, and carried by, among others, ordinary foot soldiers on the battlefield, as you can see, comparing the aristocratic knightly combat in the upper register here versus the ordinary foot soldiers whacking at each other down below with the sword and buckler. It's also used in recreational fencing for self-defense and other civilian kinds of applications as well. And particularly in that recreational context, it's something that an aristocrat might also participate in. And the distinctive features of 133, as I'm sure most people here are already familiar, the Schildschlag, that's shield strike maneuver that we saw already. And whenever the hands are forward, they're really, whenever the sword is forward, the buckler is typically kept really close to it, and that really distinguishes it from a lot of the other documentable sword and buckler styles out there. And so in some cases, say like this illustration from the Messa manuscript, it's hard to tell whether they're really using the sword and buckler in the same way. But clearly in both of these German illustrations, we're looking at something that is related to the 133 technique. The clearly recognizable shield strike right here, the long point, or a variant on long point with the hands together, pretty clearly in the same general style. Not purely German, as this English illustration of roughly the same period suggests. Again, we see positions that are pretty much characteristic of 133's style of sword and buckler combat, but very different from what you find in most later sources. This Talhofer illustration, for example, with the figure on the right with his buckler back, clearly this is not using the weapons in the same way as 133 technique would call for. Another distinctive feature of the manuscript is the dramatis personae, the characters. Most strikingly, perhaps, Walpurgis, the woman who appears on the last couple of pages of the manuscript, very stylishly dressed. You can see she's got long surcoat over her clothing. The little dots there are suggest open work shoes. Her leather shoes are sort of punched through to give a sort of stylish look of the period. Goodness knows what the hell she's doing there. Still something of a mystery. A lot of people have puzzled it over and really no clear solution. And the main characters, the priest and the student, not of the military class. These people are basically secular clerics. And I want you all to repeat after me. These are not monks.
These are not monks.
Thank you very much. You still see that and hear that out there all the time. Oh, the monks fighting in 133. They are not monks. Monks are people who go off and live in a monastery away from the ordinary world. They're supposed to be kind of living this sort of reclusive life away from secular concerns. These people are secular clergy. These are the people who are supposed to be engaged with the ordinary stuff of the real world. These are the people who would staff your parish church, who would staff your cathedral. In particular, the context here suggests that they might be associated with perhaps a cathedral school. There's very little evidence of monks engaging in swordplay, but quite a lot of it relating to secular priests, because they're really, they're kind of out in the real world. They're in contact with stuff, and they're a lot harder to control than the highly regimented lifestyle of the monks. So there's actually quite a lot of good contemporary evidence that bears up the notion that people like this priest and student, like these secular clergy, were actually engaging in swordplay, and particularly probably connected to a cathedral school. Basically, the cathedral school is where an aspiring young cleric goes to learn how to be a priest, either maybe going on to serve as a parish clergyman, or perhaps becoming part of the sort of administrative staff that's the sort of the vast bureaucracy of the medieval Catholic Church. So you go to, a promising young boy from a parish might get sent to the episcopal seat, to the bishop's cathedral, and there's a school that specializes in training young men to become full-fledged priests. And ultimately, these are what become the universities of medieval Europe. And this map shows you some of the locations and dates of the foundings of the universities. But even prior to the date when the cathedral school becomes a university, there is some kind of an academic environment already well established. And that is what the priest and student really represent. So, digging deeper into the manuscript, we can actually get something of a sense of who these people might actually have been who were involved. It is, for starters, a team undertaking. We can recognize multiple people playing a part in generating this manuscript. For example, the artwork. There are multiple hands at work, multiple artists actually producing this. Hard to pin down the exact number, but if you look, for example, comparing this illustration with this one, they were not done by the same guy. Even when an artist is working under different circumstances, one sketch, one drawing might be more elaborate than another, but you can still recognize a level of skill. The artist on the left-hand side is kind of the best one in their artistic stable, who is not surprisingly the one they use at the beginning of the manuscript. Later on in the manuscript, the drawings tend to be of a somewhat lower quality, very clearly by a different hand. And there are also three distinct hands writing the text of the manuscript. The one on the middle is really easy to distinguish from the other two. The top and bottom ones look kind of similar, but if you look, for example, at the G here in Religa, and you compare it to G's in Gladium, for example, right there, that G and that G, very different in form, and that's one of the consistent distinctions between the two hands that allows us to identify that those are two separate scribes involved in it. And the middle hand is particularly interesting because it's not a particularly beautiful hand if you compare it to the other ones that we just looked at. You know, this doesn't look as much like a professional scribe. The other two look like people who really are specialists doing this stuff. This one, it's a kind of spidery hand, and it only appears in a couple of places in the manuscript. And then, interestingly, in at least one instance, it's giving it a correction to the text that's already there. So it's very possible that that third spidery hand represents somebody who has a sort of authority in this project, somebody who's not just kind of a hired hand, but somebody who's really there maintaining the quality of the project, going back over the contents and revising them as necessary. Possibly even the person really in charge of this school, of this project of documenting the techniques, and we might possibly even be able to assign a name to it. This here, which totally flummoxed me in the initial edition, as is often the case when you're dealing with personal names and place names and such. It's really quite clear. This is the German, the Latinized version of the German name Lütger. So whoever Lütgerus is, he is somebody that has a kind of authority in relation to this this manuscript and its style of fencing. Maybe he's the sort of the master teacher. He could be the master in charge of the manuscript project itself. But clearly, we do have at this point a solid name to associate with the 133 school of combat. So, although the manuscript clearly does not come from a monastery and was not written by monks, by the late 1400s, it appears to have been in a monastery. If we look at this verse at the very beginning of the manuscript, at the top of the manuscript, quoting this verse attributed to the Renaissance humanist Silvio Piccolomini, who would go on to become a pope. It seems to be saying that the manuscript is in a monastery, and what the hell are these monks doing playing at swords? It's very inappropriate. We know quite for certain that 100 years later the manuscript was in a monastery, because we actually have documentation of how it came to end up into the hands of royal families or aristocratic German families. It was plundered from a monastery during the religious wars of the mid-1500s, and probably the Johannes Herbert, who is the fellow who picks this manuscript up, ends up giving it to Frederick William, Duke of Saxony, because his Frederick William's line eventually dies out, and through marriage, you can actually see here, there's Johannes Herbert's actual signature on one of the pages of the manuscript, and his patron's family eventually they're connected by marriage to the Dukes of Saxe-Gotha, and that's where the manuscript ends up. Somebody at least was looking at it in the late 17th century in a manuscript. We have this copy of an illustration from a manuscript of the late 1600s. Most of the manuscript is otherwise copies of material from a Talhofer manuscript. But by 1722, we know precisely where the manuscript was, because it is listed right here, Art of Fencing with Illustrations. It's in the Gotha manuscript, where it's known as manuscript 115. And it's probably during this period that some aristocratic brat gets access to the library and scribbles on the pages. Just couldn't resist this illustration. Not only do we have all this kind of mucky scribbling here on the figures, but there's the little beards and mustaches. I can only hope that he got the spanking he deserved. And the manuscript is mentioned rather interestingly by Bruns in 1799. Here he says he has a single leaf, and the description really matches 133. And this loose leaf concept is an interesting and significant one, something that we are going to come back to before too long. Wassmannsdorf examines the manuscript and has his notes from 1860 are still bound into the manuscript. And the manuscript was still in the Gotha collection in 1936, where it was creepily included in an exhibit on medieval German sports to go with the Berlin Olympics of 1936. And then, 14 years later, it appears at a Christie's auction in London. So 1950, it goes on sale, and clearly nobody at the time really knows. Certainly the Germans have lost track of it. Probably what happened is at the very end stages of World War II, the Gotha library was actually removed to get it away from the advancing Russian troops, and it moves to Coburg. And at some point in that moment of transition, somebody basically helps himself to this manuscript and probably sells it accordingly. It was lost to the Germans, in large measure forgotten until the 1980s catalog from the Royal Army's exhibit finally managed to get at least a preliminary edition of it out in, what's that, 2001 or something like that. But under very adverse circumstances. I was told one day that the Royal Armories decided they weren't going to publish it, and so I just kind of put it on the back burner, and then I got a call again, and they said, yes, we decided we want to go ahead with this, and by the way, we want it in 3 months' time. So the final version was actually quite rushed, and of course it was produced with Chivalry Bookshelf, which brought all kinds of complications in its wake as well. And so there was a lot of work that still remained to be done as to the initial publication of the book. In the book, I did publish this sort of overview of the contents of the sort of organization of the subject matter of the manuscript. And it's a little bit wonky. If you look here, I mean, it starts off just fine. And then, it seems to skip fifth guard and leave it to the end, and what's all this stuff doing? It seems, it's not clear. It's as if they had an organizational scheme, but their focus started to vanish at some point or whatever. Hard to say, based on this, what was going on. What I did not publish in the original edition, because it left me flummoxed, was the foliation of the manuscript. One of the things one has to do, looking at a manuscript, is how is it physically put together? And normally, medieval manuscript basically consists of a number of quires, gatherings of sort of folded leaves of vellum or paper or whatever, stitched together at the fold, and then stitched to each other to make up the body of the manuscript. And usually a quire looks like this. 8 leaves, each of which, there are 4 actual sheets folded over to make actual 8 leaves of 16 pages, and those all get stitched together. This is the first quire of the manuscript, which is pretty much textbook, the way it ought to be. And with 64 pages, it should be a no-brainer. But when I was kind of trying to figure out the structure of it, it just seemed a little bit wonky to me, because there seemed to be loose pages and the numbers just weren't adding up. It wasn't the way it ought to be, but the binding was so tight, it was really impossible for me to be entirely sure of what I was looking at, just precisely because what I was looking at seemed entirely wrong. Happily, in order to make this new edition happen, they unbound the manuscript to get it properly photographed, and we could settle once and for all how the manuscript is structured. And it is totally wonky. The first one is pretty much as it should be, but in the second you only have 6 leaves, 4 in the third quire, and in the last 2 quires we have 3 leaves six leaves, 3 bifolia, the folded pages, and then this extra loose one at the beginning of each of them. And this is all wrong. This is not how a medieval manuscript is put together. It's extremely inefficient. It's very unstable structurally. It's very easy for pages to come out. It's just that you just don't make a manuscript that way. So, what's happening? Well, if we look more closely at at sort of the transitions at points where the manuscript seems to be not quite right, something funny is happening. 8 verso, so that's going to be the leaf at the very end of the first quire, ends with, that's the first gathering. It ends with this. Basically, the exact same stuff that you've seen at the very beginning of the manuscript. I mean, these 2 images have already been covered. And the next one on 9 recto, the next page after this, starts a totally new sequence. So why, I mean, it always kind of bugged me. Why should they just repeat something that they've already done that we know perfectly well? Actually, it's a very good argument to suggest that there's missing material. That we have the beginning. Did you have something you wanted to say?
At the end. Not
Sure.
in this case, I did.
Sure. So there's really good reason to believe that there might be a leaf missing at this transition point. If we look at the final transition point, and this TV thing is covering up this, I believe that this is 14 verso right here. Check the other screen.
Yeah, 14.
14b.
Yeah, 14B.
Yeah. So here's the very end of the same gathering. We have this single illustration for this sequence right here, the one marked with the cross, and then it goes on and it starts a totally new sequence at the beginning of the next gathering. So again, we're kind of left hanging, so what we start to see emerging is a very strong likelihood that there was an additional bifolium, 1 leaf here and 1 leaf here, making up a perfect quire of 8 leaves. Same thing happens again right in between folio 16 and 17. We have this, this technique, and you're going to break the shield or sword from your opponent's hands, but the next illustration doesn't necessarily, it starts a new sequence basically. So it looks like there could be missing material between 16 and 17, and very likely, as we'll see, a fair bit of missing material. So what we do see is in quires 2 and 3 are really strong evidence of missing leaves. If we make this up as a full quire, we answer the question of why these sequences are lacking material. And if we stick a couple, make this up as a full quire with the additional material in the middle, it helps us to understand why the end of that breaking the shield loose technique, or breaking free the sword, seems a little bit weird. And when you actually look at this material and start to line it up, the ordering of the manuscript actually starts to make a huge amount of sense. First guard, second guard, third guard, up to here, up through fourth guard, it's working pretty well. Fifth guard seems to be skipped, but it's skipped precisely at the point where you have 4 missing leaves or 8 actual pages of content. So there's a very good likelihood that the manuscript was originally quite systematic in going through the guards in order all the way up to 7th guard, and then kind of additional special techniques saved for those final two quires. And all of this material, by the way, will be in the published edition when it comes out. So take out your mortgages now. I just wanted to remind people of the importance of not taking this or any medieval manuscript too much at face value. The physical interpretation of a written text from 500, 800 years ago is a very complicated undertaking, and anybody who systematically tries to reproduce this position on a regular basis is probably going to have to end up working long-term with a chiropractor. Medieval art is not meant to be photographic, and besides, you can't really reduce martial arts to a book. They can give us a glimpse of what they did, but you really have to be quite canny in how you interpret it. And as I said, most of the later materials on sword and buckler don't really look like 133, but there are exceptions. These illustrations here from Ludwig von Ebb's effect book of 1500 clearly show affinities with 133. They're clearly related to this material from the Cluny manuscript, the former Donaueschingen. So here, I mean, you look at how closely these illustrations line up. It's not just that they're illustrating the same style of combat. Somebody is copying. These two, one of these manuscripts could be copied from the other, or they could both be copied from some kind of a common source. But it's not simply that they're documenting a similar style. And we also get a whole family of related illustrations in the 16th century. This series from the Berlin manuscript I.33, where interestingly it's sort of longsword and buckler, has clear ties. I only gave you a couple of samples, but there's a lot of overlap between this, the Zollinger manuscript, which is dated 1556, and also stuff that you will find in Paulus Hector Meyer. And if you look a little bit deeper into the Zollinger manuscript itself, you get this kind of curious stuff going on here. These guys on the bottom that you already saw, are kind of wearing something that could be kind of contemporary mid-1500s clothing. These guys on top totally are not. The pointy shoes, the hoods, the kind of loose flowing tunics or whatever, this is not contemporary attire for Zollinger. And it becomes even clearer when you look at this Augsburg manuscript, which has various sort of preparatory materials that Paulus Hector Meyer used as he was generating his own massive compendium on the martial arts. And you look at this and it becomes really clear what you're seeing. This is a 16th century copy of some kind of medieval illustration, either directly copied or at some removes, but the origin of all this stuff is considerably older, and if you look at the costume in particular, we're looking at something that's actually roughly contemporary with 133. But not 133. None of these illustrations actually occur in 133, and the body of material that's in all of these various other sources is way bigger than the even the missing leaves could account for. There's overlap in techniques, but basically not all that much. So, interestingly, it suggests that 133 was not alone, which always puzzled me too. Like, how did they get this? The really kind of well thought out, very highly developed manuscript, sort of out of the blue. But it doesn't seem actually to have been out of the blue. All of these. So you can see the affinities, that signature Schildstrike maneuver, not actually copied from this source, but clearly related to it. And this takes us back to another one of the proper names that is really clarified in the new edition. This term really gave me trouble on the first edition. But the best interpretation is that this is somebody's name. Algersleben is a town, a village in Germany, and so it suggests that this is a proper name of a person. And what's probably being referred to is one of, who knows, how many other manuscripts on sword and buckler fighting that might actually have been circulating at the time that 133 was produced. So, now about 20 years later, from the the initial stab at working with this manuscript, we have so much more to go on. It's really exciting how much has opened up in the process of doing it. Great material to interpret, and I can only hope that it presages a much wider range of participants in the activity. I have Ken to thank for that illustration, by the way. So that's basically my quick overview of the state of the art on 133.
Wow.
Questions?
I'm just interested how much interpretation or at least good translations have been done on the other 15th century, 16th century sword and buckler material, and is there any interest in putting some of it together or trying to piece it together in a coherent way?
I don't know. You tell me.
Well, there's lots of translations in various languages, but like, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, in terms of trying to fill in the gaps.
Right. Good.
Okay.
So basically reconstruct a system, a sort of 133-ish style, plus all the other, other
Yeah.
sources.
Yeah, what you
Fitting
get is
into a
you get
hierarchy.
guys basically focus on the Bolognese, or guys focusing on 133. Frank Sonato spends a lot of time with like the Wilhelm stuff and the Meyer stuff, trying to make it into one cohesive system. And he's done actually kind of a spectacular job of being able to say this technique leads to this technique leads to this technique, unlike anybody else. The problem, and I can actually kind of agree with him. There's such a huge gap in time that I think it's logical, the progressions he's put together. But other than Frank, really, most guys tend to either get in their 133 home or their Bolognese home. And no one really plays with the Meyer stuff other than as an oddity for, to fill
I
in
think
a
it would be
gap.
interesting to include some translations of some of the other German material.
There's very little text with it, except for the
Just
Polysect de Meyer. But the Meyer is all, it's basically, he's working just from illustrations, and he's reconstructing the techniques. So these are no longer, it's no longer a combat form that's a living practice in Meyer's sort of mid-16th century. So he's kind of doing what people are doing today. He's kind of looking at these old illustrations and trying to figure out what could have been happening in order to get to this moment in combat. So he's not really very useful. The text isn't too useful in that respect.
It's tantalizing, it's too bad.
So,
Well, I think, so this is going to come back towards the end. What I'd like to do is have a little bit of a roundtable and ask the question, where do we go next on these things, right? So I think that's certainly an interesting area of research.
so in terms of the new edition, I'm already booked for copies.
There's probably professional help out for people with you in your situation,
But just, so that the word gets out, what would you say are the key differences from the old to the new one?
Key differences. I went through the text with a fine-tooth comb and compared it to the work that had been done by Sonato and Surprenant. Tremendously valuable work. I mean, when I first produced this, I was kind of like out there by myself. There was no community. And it's a huge difference, working with, having other people to kind of vet one's own work and bounce it back and forth with. So, so that would be, I would say that's the chiefest area. Plus all this stuff about the structure of the manuscript. That obviously is all quite new. and you know what that tells us about the structure of the text, and it digs deeper into the parallel sources, which back in 2001 were much less accessible. Cluny, unfortunately, had not been photographed, because at the time I had to basically get the manuscript off. So I still don't know. I haven't been able to juxtapose, and I don't know. You know what the relationship is there with Forgeng, because I haven't seen all the illustrations yet. Yeah.
I have a question. As far as your new book comes out, I'm saving up my pennies for it, but that's a lot of pennies to save up. You know if there's going to be a more economical edition of this at some point? In the low hundreds, possibly? Something that costs roughly the same as a sword instead of... That's my question.
I think eventually we'll get to that point. I don't know what the...
I would love to buy the really nice edition, but I'm just not sure how feasible it is for me.
Yeah, it's a lot of pennies to shell out.
So eventually, possibly?
I suspect eventually, I just don't know what eventually means.
$1,000 includes the autograph.
Well, then it should be worth many times that. Yeah.
I had a question about social context. You said the buckles were often carried by the common man, and I was just wondering if you could sort of explain how that actually fits in terms of the social structure that exists there. Like, what percentage of the population are we talking about? Like, what kind of income are we talking about? Only the free class and the serfs are excluded, or are we talking about something else? Talking about the lesser nobility? I'm just curious what the term means in this context.
So Chaucer's Miller carries a sword and buckler, and that would be a really good sort of touchstone to understand who's carrying this. This is not a peasant's thing to be carrying around, but somebody, you know, the miller's kind of at the top of the village hierarchy. You know, thinks well of himself. He's also a bit of a, you know, a bit of a bully boy too, and so so that's, you know, he would carry that on the road as a form of personal self-defense.
Right.
Somebody in the aristocracy doesn't have to do that because they've got an entourage for their personal self-defense.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would have been the weapon carried by the upper crust?
The civilian carrying of weapons is really something that happens for the aristocracy. That happens later. That's kind of the story of the early stages of the rapier. You know, and that's kind of starting to happen in the 1400s.
One more question.
And that's not including daggers. I mean, like, you know, there's
Everyone's got one of those.
it's what's the
That
lion.
doesn't count. That's not a real one.
Lion in Winter was absolutely right about this. You know, we're all barbarians and we carry this stuff. Yeah.
So in the 1400s, what weapon would the upper crust people started carrying that eventually transitioned to the rapier?
It's a single-handed sword, and it's about this period that you start to see nice single-handed swords with extra trimmings to protect the unarmored hand, and that's, you know, so, you know, early 1400s you start to get little finger rings because you're slipping the finger over the crossbar, and you don't like it when it gets chopped off. So that's about the period when you start to see those features happening, and it does seem to be associated with a greater likelihood of an aristocrat carrying one of these things, and it starts in the Mediterranean zone. Evolves from there.
We good? All right, thank you again very much.